pretty ironic for Ken, trust me.
All right. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, Mr. Mike Ryan. Mike is a longtime member of the Cincinnati Roundtable. He's been the president of the Cincinnati Roundtable, and he's spoken to us before on a couple of occasions, so I think we're in for a treat. It's very good. And he has, I believe, correct me, we retired, you taught at Anderson
Yeah.
High School, yes. So, very, very knowledgeable, and he also stood for me when I joined the Cincinnati Roundtable, so don't hold that against him. He stood up for me when vouched for me.
Did he know that you'd been kicked out of Easter?
Oh, we didn't discuss that. But anyway, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mr. Mike Ryan.
But again, it's always a pleasure to be back with you folks, and as far as I don't know how accurate this anecdote is. Supposedly, General Ulysses S. Grant was tone deaf, and someone asked him one time, "General, what is your favorite tune?" He replied, "One was Yankee Doodle, and the other wasn't." So that, to me, that's Ulysses S. Grant's classic style, to the point, you know. That's the way it was. Yeah. Just a quick, as far as my background, the origin of my Civil War interest really goes way back, and I'm now, 66 years old. And I was roughly about 10 years old, early in grade school. Somewhere along the line, I got hold of, I guess a Civil War book from the library, and when our school classes were starting to talk about it, and for whatever reason, I really got into this period, and I got hooked on it, and it's been that way ever since. So I'd say about 1959, when I was about 10 years old, I was really starting to get into it. And then along comes the Civil War Centennial, 1961 to 1965. Those of you may remember that period. And that really fueled my interest. And in the Civil War Centennial, in 1962, we visited the Civil War Centennial Center in Richmond, Virginia. Now, I'm 13 years old at the time. My father had a 1956 Oldsmobile, no air conditioning. My mother hated the hot summers, even in Cincinnati. And so you had to have the windows open and all that. So we're in this typical hot Virginia summer. But me, I'm just so keyed up about this. We're going to the Centennial Center. We toured that. And then I said, we got to go to this place at the Gettysburg, Virginia. And there was a place called the Battle of the Crater. And I've got to see this. I've read about this. Now, mind you, my mom's patience is about almost... Well, so they thought, okay, this is what you want to do, we'll do this. So, hot summer. And we go drive all the way down to the Gettysburg National Park. We get to the place, and I see the remains of the crater. And I am looking at this as sacred ground. Wow. What does my mother say in the midst of all this? You mean we came all this way to see a hole in the ground? I was aghast at this. How could you say this, Mom? It's not a hole in the ground. Men died here. Oh, not to her. Oh, this was a hole in the ground. It's hot. It's humid. So anyway. But my mom, bless her heart, my father is deceased now, but my mother is now 95 years old. So her mind is still good, but yes, that's where where the interest in this period of our American history really got going. In October of 1962, my aunt and uncle, of course, they knew of my passion for this. They got wind of an appearance at the University of Cincinnati of Bruce Catton. Very familiar name, I'm sure,
Yes.
in Civil War literature. And I knew who he was. Now, most kids my age would have said, Bruce who? But Bruce Cannon to me was like big time. This was like a superstar of Civil War literature. You know, I was already reading books by him. So my aunt and uncle took me to it, and I got to hear that man right there. And I started reading books by first, like in early late 60s, like The Gray Fox by Robert E. Lee, The Gray Fox by Bert Davis, 8 Days to Appomattox, also by Bert Davis, those books like that. And then finally, there was a series at the local library in my area as a kid, and it was Joseph Altshuler. He wrote a series of books on the Civil War for young people. And it must have been written about 1930s or so. In fact, my father read them. He remembered those books. So here I am as a kid in the early 60s, riding my bicycle 3 miles from my house to the library to get out my books. It was one of 2 categories. I brought back a Civil War book or a baseball biography, because I was playing baseball then. And so those are 2 things. So anyway, and as he's been said, I've been a member of the Cincinnati Civil War Roundtable since 1977. So it's going 38 years. So that's my introduction. Now, as far as the sources, first of all, when I first started giving programs, my first one was in September of 1978, my second year, and my topic to choose was Robert E. Lee after the war. I was really interested in that period of what happened to him after the war and the influence that he generated in the South by his demeanor, his attitude in the post-war era. So I focused on that. And then also I did a program on Robert E. Lee mystique. You know, what's his appeal to the people even to this day, the hold he has on the American public to this day. So those were the main things. And then I got into Cincinnati's own Union General William Haynes Lytle. And of course, if you heard Lytle Park, where the family home was, which unfortunately was torn down in 1909. And it was after a heated battle between people who wanted to save the Lytle home, and you had folks like Patrick Mullen, who was on the Parks Committee, Grounds Committee, and he said no, he wanted that new park, Lytle Park. He said that was his concession, we'll name it Lytle Park. Well, that's nice. The only problem is, and by the way, I am one of the greatest admirers of Abraham Lincoln. But when you walk in the entrance of Lytle Park, you see this tall, majestic statue of Lincoln. Lytle, people would say, well, who's Lytle? Where's Lytle? There's no statue, no marker, nothing on him. So that to me is still, I think it's a shame that it's been that way to this day. So anyway, so you've heard my spiel on that. Now, so I've gone through Robert E. Lee, Lytle, and I thought, for this time, what do I focus on? And I think Lincoln. In fact, I was asked to give a program on Lincoln earlier this year for a Sons of Union Veterans group up in Hamilton. And I'm thinking, okay, what do I say? And I looked at my Lincoln books I had available in my office library, and I'm thinking, aha, the Gettysburg Address. First of all, it's short, didn't have to read a whole long thing. But on the other hand, I also wanted, the appeal of this particular address, this speech that he gave. And I think that this has meaning for us even today. So, the 3 sources that I referred to, that I used for this program for tonight, This is the one, the key one I use. This was published in 1992 by Gary Wills. Lincoln, Gettysburg, the words that remade America. And it's very, very good, very good. If you get a chance to get a copy of this or look up online, look for this reference, it's Gary Wills. You know, it was a very good source. But the other two sources I used in addition to this, Volume 2 of the Civil War narrative by Shelby Foote. I'm sure you're familiar with that one.
Yes.
So there are several pages on that, and it's very, very good background material leading up to the Gettysburg Address. And finally, the other one I used it was simply just called Lincoln. It's by David Donald. Very good biography. And it's very good, you know, he does a great job on this. And you know, when you think of this, there's thousands of books on Lincoln. I mean, it's amazing, the amount of material on him. So, but those are my three sources I used to prepare for this program. Now, before I will read the speech later on. So what I'd like to do is to kind of just give you aspects of it to, you know, first of all, what's ironic is this Gettysburg Address has 272 words. Now you got a book, a guy who's read a whole book on this, over 272 words. Amazing. But this is very good. He goes into a whole lot of things that go into it, you know, the to, during, and after. So, he also, Mr. Gary Wells makes a point that he feels that when you say Gettysburg Address, address is really more applicable to Edward Everett. As you may recall, was the main speaker. He was actually the main feature speaker for this. And he spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln spoke about 3 minutes. When it comes to what was the situation when the armies left the Gettysburg area, and you saw, when you read about what the poor inhabitants of the town of Gettysburg went through. And I cannot imagine how horrifying for the townspeople, men, women, and children. Now think about this, there's about 17 square miles of battlefield around that area. Think of in this hot July summer, and Lee's army has retreated. Eventually, General Meade's army, George Gordon Meade, Union Army of the Potomac, they left the area. And what did they leave behind? Thousands of bodies. Now, it's a gruesome topic, but in order to deal with this thing, you have to kind of deal with what was going on before. That you have thousands of decaying bodies. The stench in a hot summer, I cannot fathom for the townspeople there day after day. People trying to bury the bodies. And if what bodies were buried at all, shallow trenches, or a grave here and there, and hogs were going after the bodies. So that is the situation. What it was estimated in a town of 2,500, it was estimated they had to cope with about 5,000 dead horses and mules. Also not buried, and that to the stench. And about 8,000 bodies scattered around. Unbelievable. I can't even fathom what they went through. By November 19th, the day of the Gettysburg Address ceremonies, only about a third of those 8,000 bodies have been buried. Also, the project, the Gettysburg Cemetery Commission, they were, contracted for people to bury. And there were various prices, but the winning bid for contracting was, the winning bid was $1.59 per corpse. But at the time when the Gettysburg ceremony was taking place, there were still burials going on. They were nowhere near finished whatsoever. And one of the problems is trying to identify, of course, whatever identification, you know, there might be a little piece of paper or a sticker that somebody might have carved a name, what have you. Now, man, especially for the Confederates, families in the South, no one would have an idea where these guys were from, or what information they might have had on it at all. So you had, also, by the way, it was estimated during that 3-day battle, in terms of ammunition expended, artillery, musketry, pistols, it was estimated that 569 tons of ammunition in 3 days. 569 tons. And of course you had relic seekers running all over the place, you know, looking for bullets, bayonets, etc. You had that going on as well. Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin selected a man who was a banker and an attorney in Gettysburg, David Wills. He selected David Wills to head the Gettysburg Cemetery Commission. By the way, I've been to Gettysburg twice, and on my ever-lengthening bucket list, before hopefully if the good Lord keeps me on for a few more years on this earth, I'd like to get back to Gettysburg one more time. And one of the things, at the last time I was there, the David Wills house was not open for touring. It was kind of like a private residence at the time. But since then, from my understanding, that is now available for touring. You can tour the David Wills house, which is located right by the main square of Gettysburg. And the emphasis was not to be concerned about state, you know, as far as competing with different states competing with each other, you know, about the burials. So they wanted to get away from that. The William Saunders, he was what they would call in those days, it was a relatively new concept in cemeteries. A rural, or like in the country type atmosphere of a cemetery. He was what they call a rural architect. He was trained in Scotland as to how you create a cemetery in a rural fashion. So he was hired for this task. And one of the things, the major thing he did at Gettysburg, I don't know if you've been there, you've seen the Gettysburg Memorial near where Lincoln spoke and all that. It's a very, very impressive sight. What he did was he graded the hill in curving ranks. He wanted to make sure everything was like a curves, like a semi-hemispheric style. And he did this in terms of equality, state-wise. So this eliminated any chance of states arguing with each other or competing with each other for spaces of what they're choosing. So that's why you see that if you go there the next time, you'll see the curving aspect of it in ranks. In the meantime, Saunders visited Lincoln at the White House and showed him his plans and showed him the topography of how it was going to be. And Saunders came away impressed that Lincoln was familiar with the place names because he had been given, of course, reports by the Union generals during the battle, Little Round Top, all the different ridges and everything. So Lincoln had a pretty good idea of what, he had not been there yet, but he got a familiarity with reports on the topography of that area. Now, originally, it was supposed to start in October, around October 23rd. The Gettysburg Commission wanted to do it then. Well, Edward Everett, when he was informed of that, he says, well, I can't get my speech done by then. I need more time on that. So they managed to agree on going up to November 19th. But originally it was supposed to be October 23rd. Now when we get to the day of the ceremony, it was estimated there were about 15 to 20,000 in attendance that day on November 19th, 1863. The programs that were distributed to people, the program of itself, first it was music by Birchfield's band. The next was prayer by the Reverend T.H. Stockton, Doctor of Divinity. Now, his prayer was about 4 times the length of Lincoln's speech. And the third part of the program was the music by the Marine Band. Fourth, what they term oration by the Honorable Edward Everett. But again, he spoke, his took about 2 hours. But then that was not unusual in those days. You know, it's hard for us in the modern 20th century to realize that back then, that was entertainment. To hear a great speaker. Oh, well, and Edward Everett was one of the best in his time. And so he was a big deal. The next line of the program was music again. And it was a hymn composed by B.B. French, Esquire. Now, he was last minute inserted into this program because for some reason, the 3 poets, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, William Cullen Bryant, John Greenleaf Whittier, those are famous names in our American literature and poetry, they begged off in being asked in doing this. They, for whatever reasons, they did not want to be a part of that. So, I think it was Ward Layman, who was Lincoln's bodyguard and friend, he managed to get a friend of his, B.B. French, last minute substitution, because these poets were not going to come. The next one is where Lincoln comes in. It was listed as saying, dedicatory remarks by the President of the United States. That's the way it was put, dedicatory remarks. The next one was a dirge, sung by a choir selected for the occasion. And finally, the last item of the program, the benediction by the Reverend H.L. Bauer, Doctor of Divinity. That was your program. Now, if you might have read the part of the story where there was a photograph that was later discovered on the stand where people were sitting on the speakers and all that were sitting on the platform, and someone discovered that there was Lincoln in there. He had just sat down. You can't really see it very well, but they could vouch it's him. Well, the photographer, supposedly, he was kind of in the crowd, and he's trying to get his camera all ready. Because it was a plate glass type, it was the tripods, and he figures, oh, Lincoln's going to get up there, and he's going to, his talk will, he's thinking it's going to be a fairly lengthy speech. He's got time to get this set up, and right where he says, of the people, by the people, he sits down. He thought, oh my gosh. And there were people around him, they were fascinated with what he was doing with the camera. So, but the author, Gary Wills, says, well, if you would have looked at the program, he could have timed it better. But he just presumed that Lincoln was going to give a speech of some length, not 2-3 minutes. The speech, when Lincoln gave it, was interrupted by applause, according to newspaper accounts, at different times in the speech, interrupted by applause about 5 times in about 3 minutes. Now, Lincoln did not have what you call one of those deep voice. He still had a little bit of the Kentucky accent, and he had what was called, in fact, one person in the audience remembered he spoke in a, quote, sharp, unmusical, treble voice, unquote. And when you look at movies, when you and I remember the famous movie on Lincoln portrayed by Raymond Massey, remember him? Henry Fonda did one on Lincoln. Problem was, when they spoke in the film, it was baritone. They did not speak in a treble, more of a shrill voice. However, even though with that kind of voice, it was generally agreed that Lincoln, I mean, bear in mind, he, being an attorney in Illinois, he was in the famous debates with Douglas, that he was known to be a good speaker. And his voice could carry. So it may be kind of shrill, maybe it's not going to treble, but you can hear him. And he spoke clearly. So he was viewed as a good speaker in his time. On November 2nd, 17 days before the event, he got the invitation from the Gettysburg Commission. And he accepted it. November 19th was less than 3 weeks away. The committee, headed by David Wills, the attorney I mentioned earlier, the committee was concerned about his, quote, his ability to speak upon such a grave and solemn occasion, unquote. Because there's his reputation kind of float around that Lincoln could be, he liked to tell coarse jokes, he kind of like, goofy kind of humor at times, and they thought, they were a little hesitant, he's going to break onto something really dumb, not acceptable in a serious occasion. They informed him, via this letter, they were trying to be diplomatic with him, but they said one of the statements was, they informed him that ceremonies, quote, doubtless be very imposing and solemnly impressive, unquote. It was kind of let him know this is a very serious occasion, which he didn't really need to be told that, but that's what they were concerned about over there. To continue on in this letter from the Cemetery Commission, they went on to say, it is the desire that after the oration, remember that program, you as chief executive of the nation formally set apart these grounds to their sacred use. Now, here's the key, this is at the end, by a few appropriate remarks. Just a few. Don't go on long and make sure they're appropriate to the occasion. Now, let's go to Edward Everett a bit. At the time, he is the featured speaker, of course. He spoke first. He was about 69 years old. Now, look at the background. He was former governor of Massachusetts, minister to England for President John Tyler, president of Harvard, successor to Daniel Webster as Secretary of State under President Millard Fillmore. And in 1860, John Bell's running mate on the Constitutional Union ticket in the presidential race. I mean, that is, you talk about a pedigree. supposedly, and there's a little debate in the books that I use, supposedly Lincoln was disappointed at the end of his speech. He supposedly said to his friend, Ward Layman, who also was the acting marshal for the event in Gettysburg, getting things all set up. He's the one who got all the horses and mules set up in the square of Gettysburg to get all the key dignitaries on them. Some walked to the cemetery, which is a couple miles away. But Lincoln he was the first on the horse. But Ward Layman was, and his assistant marshals, they were all getting those things set up. But he supposedly said to Ward Layman, "Layman, that speech won't scour. It is a flat failure and the people are disappointed." And of course, scour means, he was referring to, back in the days of Illinois, with farming, and when you're plowing the ground, a special type of blade, and would scour, meaning like if it was wet clay, it was able to slide off. And that's supposedly his expression. Now, one of the authors, the thing about Layman is, you have to be careful because he wasn't always accurate in his facts. It wasn't always accurate. So there's a little debate on it, because then on the other hand, there was supposedly Lincoln was pleased with what he had done. He was satisfied with what he had done. So you had the differences of view. Edward Everett paid what I consider like a supreme compliment. He said to Lincoln, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Wow. One of the premier speakers in the nation. And he wasn't buttering up the president, he meant that. You got the central idea. And of course, Lincoln, of course, appreciated that. Now, Everett, he went into great detail in his 2 hours. He covered the war itself. He did the whole thing. And what amazing was, he memorized it all. That's incredible. He had his speech right there with him, but he had it memorized. And he spoke for 2 hours. And of course, the people, you've got top-notch speaking entertainment right there. When Lincoln, had to leave Gettysburg by train, of course, he left at 6:30 p.m. on July 3rd for Washington. My little pet peeve, I put in parentheses, it was Washington City at the time, not D.C. And I see that mixed up from time to time. I wanted to say that, do your little homework, it's not D.C., it's Washington City. But he left for Washington City that afternoon, and supposedly he was observed to be, quote, gloomy and listless, unquote. Now, right before I get onto this, what was going on in Lincoln's household was their son, Tad, became seriously ill. And Mary Lincoln was supposedly hysterical that her husband was going to leave them because they had lost their son, Willie, about 20 months ago. So, of course, understandably, they were going, but Lincoln had to tell her, I have to go up and do this. So he was obviously torn. So he's on his way back in the train. He's supposedly gloomy and listless. He became weary. He needed a wet towel on his eyes and forehead. He was back in the Capitol by midnight. Fortunately, he learned that Ted, his son, had recovered from what was described as a feverish ailment, unquote. However, Lincoln was the one who became ill. The doctors examined him, and he had contracted what was called varioloid, which was a form of smallpox. So he was quite ill in the succeeding weeks after his return. Now, this is the only thing, I use books, I looked at information from my books, and I wrote them handwritten, all these, but I thought, just for the heck of it, everything's online these days, I thought, I'm going to look up Gettysburg Address online. And there was about several entries on this. And I'm looking at it, so I'll click on this one, and I got it printed. And I wanted to share with you on the Gettysburg Address. It's talking about copies. There were copies he had made, he had written for people. But on June 1st, 1865, a few months after the war ended, Senator Charles Sumner referred to the most famous speech ever given by President Abraham Lincoln. In his eulogy on the slain president, because he was assassinated in April, he called the Gettysburg Address a, quote, monumental act, unquote. This is Charles Sumner saying this. He said Lincoln was mistaken that, quote, the world will little note, nor remember what we say here, unquote. Rather, the Bostonian remarked, the world noted at once what he said, and will never cease to remember it. The battle itself was less important than the speech. And it goes on to say that there are 5 known copies of the speech in Lincoln's handwriting, each with a slightly different text and name for the people who received them. 2 of them I'll mention, well 3, John Nicolay and John Hay, they were secretaries and assistants to Lincoln, they got them. Edward Everett, George Bancroft, who was a historian, and his stepson, a Colonel Alexander Bliss. So they have all their copies. Now, there's been other copies, but they have been misplaced or lost. Or some could not be so. But one of the things that was asked of Lincoln was, can I have a copy of it? Because I wanted to do something for the Soldiers Fund. To Soldiers Relief, to provide money for them. So he went along with that for relief agencies. I'll just mention the first one, what is called the Nicolay copy, Lincoln's assistant. John G. Nicolay, President Lincoln's personal secretary. This is considered the first draft of the speech, begun in Washington on White House stationery. The second page is written on different paper stock, indicating it was finished in Gettysburg before the cemetery dedication began. Lincoln gave this draft to Nicolay, who went to Gettysburg with Lincoln and witnessed the speech. The Library of Congress owns this manuscript. And Library of Congress also owns the Hay copy as well. Edward Everett's copy, let me get this, is the state of Illinois acquired it, and it's preserved in the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. The Bancroft copy is now owned by Cornell University. I think that'll do. So, now, thing about I wrote out the Gettysburg Address for myself, and I highlighted certain things, because I'm going to read from this book, and I'll explain that in a minute. One of the things to remember in reading this speech, as opposed to Edward Everett's, Everett goes in great detail about all what was going on. But there is no reference to soldiers, place names, slavery, Constitution, or the South. None of those things are mentioned in the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln avoided all that for his reasons. But if you also look at Lincoln's writing style, first of all, he had a great command of words. And he had a cadence. When you read his words, it's like a cadence. If you were to read them out loud, there's a cadence to them. There's a rhythm to his words. Even the sound, for example, in the first line, fourscore and 7 years ago. Well, listen to the words, fourscore. They sound the same. The four and score, when you pronounce it. Also, he could have said 87 years ago. Think about that. But he chose fourscore and 7. I think it's a little nicer ring to the beginning. Fourscore and 7 years ago. He uses the word nation, something like at least 7 times. Nation. Doesn't say the Union, doesn't say the Confederacy. The nation. He uses words like the word dedicate and dedicated several times throughout the address. When he repeats, like he has a cadence in this one, we cannot dedicate, we cannot concentrate, we cannot hallow this ground. You see, you hear the rhythm. We cannot do this, and this. Consecrate is mentioned more once. So, now we come to this. Now, this is my book from childhood. Remember I was telling you earlier where I was really getting into all this, and of course getting into books, and my parents, of course, my loving parents. They bought for me a book, I was just in grade school, early in grade school, and I got a book on Tale of Two Cities. It was blue colored, like this, and this one, Stories and Speeches of Abraham Lincoln. And I've had this ever since as a child. This is a treasured possession. So I will read, if you'll allow me, indulge me, I will read the Gettysburg Address from my childhood book. Ladies and gentlemen, 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Believe it or not, when this thing came out, there were people upset with him. In fact, they were talking about, there's no mention of the word Constitution in your speech. And you got these references to Declaration, independence going way back. In fact, this writer even says that Lincoln was going beyond, even back to the times of the Pilgrims, in terms of that. So there were people being picky with him, saying, you have made no mention to the Constitution at all. But dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we do this. But in a large, now here's this next sentence. Listen to the cadence of the words, of the rhythmic pattern. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. We cannot. The brave men living and dead who struggled here. And by the way, he first uses the word here several times. Doesn't mention any specifics like the Union Army fought this part over there, or here, or back. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. Again, that word here is emphasized. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And I want to go on, just very quick, right at the tail end here. I go to Lincoln's second inaugural, which was given 2 years later, in March in 1865, about a month before he's assassinated. It was said, I read somewhere where it said, this writer said that the Lincoln's second inaugural is almost like a companion piece to the Gettysburg Address. If you connect the two together, you kind of get some of the similar themes, just different wording. I'm not going to read his whole second novel, but there's a couple of things here I want to just share with you. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. But he goes on to say, but let us not judge not, that we be not judged. See the cadence of that? Let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both sides, north and south, prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. And down further into his speech, I would go for this. Again, the writing cadence. Fondly do we hope. Fervently do we pray. Fondly do we hope. Fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may soon pass away. And then towards it, he goes, and you've heard this one, I'm sure, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphans, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Now, I wrote down a couple of words, just thoughts for discussion, or fun things to think about. Now, we can say this about any speech we've heard, any document in our what's going on in the world, in our country. But as far as the Gettysburg Address is concerned, my question is, what does the Gettysburg Address mean for us today? What does it mean for us? In an ever-changing political, economic, and military world. Think about that. The words that he uses, the thoughts he expresses, can in a sense, I think, apply to what we're going through today. And then I leave you with the final question. What does government of the people, by the people, for the people, mean to us today? Now, when you think about what's going on with our government, the presidential scene, the Senate, Congress, everything's going on, all these decisions made. I think Lincoln is trying to say that it's we the people, we are of this government that's been created for us, a part of us as American citizens. I'm looking at this as I am an American citizen. What does that mean for me as an American citizen? Not only are we of this government, we are a part of it. Also, it is for us. What we invested in our representatives is for us as well, as American citizens. And it's by the people. It's by us also. So in a sense, I think the word by implies we have the right, in our voting, to who we think is best to represent this country, this state, and so on. In our own local governments. It's by us as well. We are a part of this American experiment that Lincoln espouses on. And folks, I thank you for your patience.